It was a scorching July afternoon in 1961 when 13-year-old Lisa Schuh, visiting her grandmother in Joplin, Missouri, took her little dog for a walk down the alley behind 730 Porter Avenue. The neighborhood was calm, its summer stillness broken only by the sound of cicadas and the distant hum of window fans. Lisa, a Wichita girl with an infectious smile and a fondness for animals, had no way of knowing she was about to come face to face with a predator. Just across the alley, Vernon Stevens, a local painter, was inside his garage finishing a job. He had often seen Lisa playing in her grandmother's yard and was used to watching her walk by with her dog. He paid little attention at first when he noticed a green and white 1956 Chevrolet roll slowly down the narrow alley. The car pulled up and stopped under the window where Stevens was working. Something about the scene caught his attention. The man inside the car, partially obscured from view, seemed to be examining a map, glancing up occasionally as if waiting for someone. Lisa appeared at the far end of the alley, walking peacefully with her small dog on a leash. As she passed the car, Stevens overheard a man's voice call out. Lisa hesitated, then took a step toward the car. The man said something else. Lisa responded with a sentence that froze Stevens in place. "Well, I couldn't help it." Then the car door opened. In a swift and terrible moment, the man stepped out, grabbed Lisa by the arm, and shoved her into the front seat of the Chevrolet. Stevens watched in horror as Lisa clapped her hand over her mouth, her face twisted in fear. She crawled into the floorboards of the car, her little dog pulled in behind her by the leash. Stevens saw the driver's hand rise into view, holding a revolver. The painter's instincts kicked in. He dropped his brush and bucket and bolted into the street. He caught a partial view of the license plate, a combination of letters and numbers he quickly scribbled down. Then he ran to the house next door and shouted to his neighbor, David Cogbill, "Did you see that?" Cogbill had indeed seen the same thing, including Lisa on the floor of the car. At first, he had thought it was a young girl sneaking out with a boyfriend. But now it was clear something far more sinister had occurred. Stevens ran inside and told Lisa's grandmother what had just happened. "Call the police. Somebody just forced her into a car in the alley with a gun," he said. Law enforcement responded immediately, broadcasting the vehicle description across the city. Roughly 1 hour later, sharp-eyed Detective Charles Hickman spotted the Chevrolet as it traveled back through town. He followed the vehicle, confirming that the license plate matched the one Stevens had provided. Sergeant Jack Fay joined the pursuit. The two officers closed in as the car approached the intersection of 7th Street and Schifferdecker Avenue. Sergeant Fay shot his cruiser across the road, cutting off the escape. He leapt from his car and raised his revolver directly at the driver's head. Behind the wheel was Charles Harvey Odom, a 29-year-old ex-convict from Wellington, Kansas. Beneath the seat of his car, police found a loaded .22 caliber automatic pistol. Odom offered no resistance. He was arrested on the spot. The officers had no idea what had happened to Lisa, who was not in the vehicle. The question on everyone's mind was the same. Where was Lisa? Piston second. Later that evening, after a frantic search involving dozens of officers, Lisa was found in a remote area northwest of Joplin, near Turkey Creek. She was crumpled in a brushy area just off Bell Center Road, near a bridge under construction. Her clothing had been scattered nearby. Lisa was unconscious but alive, her face and skull crushed by repeated blows from a blunt object. Investigators initially feared she had also been shot. She was rushed to Freeman Hospital in Joplin in what doctors described as extremely critical condition. Police believed she had been driven to the desolate spot shortly after being abducted. There, Odom had raped her, bludgeoned her with a rock, and left her for dead. The girl's blood was splattered across the rocks and weeds around her. Lisa was later transferred to St. John's Hospital in Springfield, Missouri, where she underwent emergency brain surgery. Odom was immediately charged with rape. Prosecutors warned that if Lisa died, they would file a charge of first-degree murder. Captain Walter Flenner and other Joplin detectives began the long process of interrogating Odom. At first, he claimed to remember nothing. He said he had experienced a blackout and could not recall how he ended up in that area of town. When pressed, he told officers he might have done it, then later recanted. As evidence mounted and witness accounts corroborated the timeline, Odom's story crumbled. Meanwhile, Lisa clung to life. She underwent multiple brain operations. Doctors were forced to remove portions of her skull to relieve the swelling. Her recovery was uncertain. She remained in critical condition for days. But slowly, miraculously, she began to improve. By late summer, she was able to speak, though the right side of her body remained paralyzed. Her doctors were astounded by her resilience. Lisa's mother, Margaret Schuh, stayed by her daughter's side throughout the ordeal. The family chose to keep details of Lisa's condition private, but they confirmed that she had suffered irreversible neurological damage and would likely require a wheelchair for the rest of her life. When Lisa was finally released from the hospital, her return home to Wichita was bittersweet. Meanwhile, as Lisa began her recovery, the legal machinery prepared for trial. Public outrage in Joplin and across Missouri was swift and vocal. The brutality of the crime, combined with the age and innocence of the victim, made Odom the object of intense public fury. Odom, who had previously served time for burglary and theft, became the face of a sadistic predator. At his preliminary hearing, Odom waived his right to contest the charges. Prosecutors began building a case for the death penalty. Jasper County Circuit Judge Ray E. Watson was assigned to preside over the trial. Chief Prosecutor Stuart Tatum made it clear from the beginning that he intended to seek the harshest sentence available. Tatum did not mince words in his public statements. He called Odom a monster, a man who had carried out a, quote-unquote, sadistic, inhuman attack on a helpless child. He declared that Odom's actions represented one of the worst crimes in Missouri's recent history. The public agreed. Lisa's recovery gave prosecutors a rare opportunity. Though she could not testify in court due to her injuries, her survival meant that Odom could be charged and tried for rape rather than murder. In the fall of 1961, Odom was indicted and brought to trial on the charge of forcible rape of a child under the age of 14. The courtroom was packed on the first day of trial. Reporters lined the back rows, and local families filled the benches. Many had come to show support for the Schuh family. Others came simply to witness what promised to be one of the most dramatic criminal trials in Joplin's history. Odom entered the courtroom wearing a gray suit, his expression cold and unreadable. He was represented by two court-appointed attorneys. Prosecutor Tatum began the trial by laying out the evidence in graphic detail. He described Lisa's injuries, the testimony of Vernon Stevens and David Cogbill, and the discovery of the weapon under the driver's seat. He held up the clothing Lisa had been wearing that day, bloodied and torn, presenting it to the jury as a symbol of innocence defiled. Tatum told the jury this girl was 13 years old. She was walking her dog. She had no way to defend herself. He took everything from her. The defense offered a different story. They argued that Odom had suffered from mental instability, the product of a broken home and years of drifting. They claimed he had blacked out and had no memory of the crime. They called character witnesses who described Odom as someone who had been dealt a hard life. He was not evil, they said, just damaged. But the jury remained unmoved. The testimonies of Stevens and Cogbill were powerful and detailed. The timeline of the abduction and Odom's arrest lined up perfectly. The physical evidence in the car and at the scene of the attack was overwhelming. On the second day of trial, the courtroom grew tense as the prosecution wrapped up its final arguments. Tatum concluded by saying, "You have seen what this man did. You have heard what he took from that little girl. I ask you to give her the justice she was denied that day in the alley." The jury retired to deliberate. The room remained hushed while they were gone. Reporters whispered their predictions. Families clutched hands. 40 minutes later, the verdict came in, guilty. The sentence: death in Missouri's gas chamber. Odom showed no visible reaction as the verdict was read. His mother, who had sat quietly in the back row of the courtroom, wept as sheriff's deputies led her son away. The crowd outside the courthouse cheered when the verdict was announced. For them, justice had been served. But for the Schuh family, the journey was far from over. Charles Harvey Odom sat in a prison cell in the Missouri State Penitentiary as the weight of the death sentence closed in around him. The courtroom verdict in November 1961 had been swift and decisive, but the process of carrying out a death sentence in Missouri was anything but fast. Appeals, petitions, and motions stretched the case out for years. Lisa Schuh and her family were left waiting. Lisa, now a teenager growing into adulthood, bore the scars of that summer day in 1961 with quiet dignity. Her right side remained paralyzed. She required a wheelchair, and her days were often filled with physical therapy and ongoing medical attention. But she survived, and that survival stood as a kind of victory in itself. Her brother, Rodney Roostman, became a quiet but constant voice of support. He carried the weight of her suffering with him as he watched the legal system grind forward with painful slowness. Public reaction to the case had not dulled with time. Letters to the editor, courtroom observers, and neighbors across Joplin and Wichita spoke out repeatedly about the length of the appeals process. To them, the facts were not in question. Odom had committed an unspeakable crime. His guilt had been established beyond any doubt. The community wanted closure. Meanwhile, Odom's attorneys pursued every legal avenue available. His legal team argued that his original trial had not fully accounted for his mental state. They claimed his confession had been improperly obtained and that the sentencing phase had relied too heavily on emotional testimony. They appealed to higher courts and filed motions for stays of execution. Each time, the courts affirmed the sentence. The Missouri Supreme Court reviewed the case in detail and upheld the original conviction. Federal courts examined the appeals, including arguments of due process and Eighth Amendment violations. Ultimately, every court at every level agreed Charles Harvey Odom would die in the gas chamber. By 1964, nearly 3 years after the attack, a date was set, March 6th. Odom would be among the last inmates executed by lethal gas in Missouri. Just a few years later, the state would move to lethal injection as the preferred method of capital punishment. Odom's execution became part of a turning point in Missouri's history of justice. The gas chamber at the Missouri State Penitentiary in Jefferson City was a cylindrical steel capsule, sealed and sterile. Inmates were strapped into a chair and locked into the chamber. Cyanide pellets were dropped into a vat of acid below the chair, releasing a toxic gas that would kill within minutes. Witnesses sat behind a glass pane, separated from the condemned only by their breath and the weight of what they came to watch. Lisa's brother Rodney was one of the people who felt torn about watching Odom die. He did not seek revenge, but he wanted resolution. "I have to question why it takes 12 years to execute him under the circumstances," he said in a Globe interview years later. "I never thought anyone had a right to all of these appeals. It's just too long." Rodney spoke of justice not as vengeance, but as closure. He had watched his sister endure every consequence of Odom's violence. He had seen her fight to recover, to relearn how to speak and move, and live in a body broken by someone else's cruelty. For him, justice meant accountability, and it had taken too long to arrive. Kevud is secluded. Odom's behavior in prison remained cold and emotionless. He never expressed true remorse. At one point, he reportedly said, "I wanted to be caught," but that statement stood in contrast to the many deflections and memory lapses he had claimed before. He never attempted to explain his actions in full, nor did he write a letter of apology to Lisa or her family. On March 6, 1964, the guards arrived at Odom's cell in the early morning hours. He dressed quietly, his face pale. He was walked down the corridor, past inmates who watched in silence. At the threshold of the gas chamber, Odom paused but said nothing. He was strapped into the metal chair. The room around him fell still. Witnesses took their seats. A curtain was drawn back to reveal the sealed chamber. Guards activated the mechanism. The cyanide pellets dropped. Within minutes, Odom was dead. Outside the prison walls, Lisa's family received word. The man who had stolen her childhood, crippled her body, and haunted her dreams was gone. There were no celebrations, no great pronouncements. There was only relief. Lajos, The Schuh family had waited nearly 3 years for that moment. But in many ways, the damage Odom had done could not be undone by a court order or a gas chamber. Lisa lived with the consequences every day. Her mother, Margaret, had once described her daughter's condition as a lifetime of servitude, but Lisa never saw herself that way. She carried on with quiet strength, refusing to be defined by the crime. In later interviews, family members remembered Lisa's will to survive as the real story. "They tried to kill her," one relative said, "but she came back. That's what matters." Years later, the case of Charles Harvey Odom continued to appear in legal textbooks and capital punishment debates. It was cited in discussions about the limitations of appeals, the ethics of execution methods, and the balance between justice and mercy. Some argued that Odom's execution, while justified, reflected a system that needed reform. Others saw it as a rare example of justice actually being served. For the city of Joplin, the case was burned into memory. Residents who had lived through it recalled the fear and fury that gripped the town in 1961. Parents clutched their children tighter. Neighbors watched each other with a little more caution. Reporters who covered the trial never forgot the sight of Lisa's torn dress on the evidence table or the expression on her mother's face as the verdict was read. Even years later, people remembered Vernon Stevens, the quiet painter whose quick thinking helped save Lisa's life. Had he not seen what happened in the alley, had he not written down that license plate, Charles Odom might have vanished into the night. Lisa might never have been found. In court, Assistant Prosecutor Ben Pyle had stood before the jury and said, quote, "He had a choice. He could drive away. He had a choice before he raped her in the secluded, desolate area. And he had a choice before he beat her with a rock and left her for dead." It was that trio of choices that stuck with the jurors and the public alike. Odom had made decision after decision to harm, to violate, and to destroy. He had done so not in a moment of panic but with calculation. He had not broken stride when the police closed in. He did not cry, did not plead. He was, as prosecutor Stuart Tatum described him, an exhibitionist, a predator, and a man without remorse. In his closing argument, Tatum had said, "If there was ever a more heinous, despicable, fully executed case of forcible rape in this county, I cannot think of one thing Charles Harvey Odom didn't do." Lisa Schuh lived the rest of her life as a survivor. Her case stood as a brutal reminder of the horrors that could lurk in broad daylight, in a quiet alley behind a family home. But it also stood as a testimony to resilience. Though she never walked again, she never surrendered her spirit. Lisa Schuh livre maiasis. 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 Justice, when it came, was imperfect and delayed. Lisa Schuh livre maias. Maiasis. Lisa Schuh livre maias. Frisho livre maias. And Charles Harvey Odom, whose name once inspired fear, was buried in a grave few would ever visit. The world moved on, but those who remembered would never forget the sound of a paintbrush in a window, a girl and her dog in the alley, and a city that watched evil try to win and fail.